Welcome back to the Safety Roadmap Podcast. Today, we'll be touching on a topic that's often brought up by those looking to secure their workplace from hazards and care about health and safety.
All right, ready to dive into a topic that's way more intense than I ever pictured.
Let's fire it up.
We're talking welding safety today, and I have to admit, when these sources from norbook.com landed on my digital doorstep, well, I thought, metal, heat, how complicated can it be?
You'd be surprised.
Turns out, very NRE. And these sources, they're originally in Arabic.
Showing just how global this whole thing is. Safety, it's a universal language.
Right, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about the forces involved. We're not just talking about, don't burn yourself.
Not even close. We're talking about harnessing enough energy to melt metal and doing it safely.
Which, now that you mention it, is a pretty good definition of welding itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For anyone who's never even held a soldering iron, let's back up. What is welding exactly?
At its core, it's like using heat to permanently glue metal pieces together.
Okay, so metal glue, but way more high-tech.
Exactly. You're melting the edges of those pieces until they flow together, become one. But there are so many ways to achieve that fusion. Arc welding, gas welding, resistance welding, each with its own quirks.
So many choices. We actually have an image here showing all these different welding positions. Flat, horizontal, even overhead. Why so many? Is it just about finding a comfy stance for the welder?
Comfort matters, for sure, but those positions you mentioned, each one brings its own challenges. Controlling the molten metal, making sure the weld is strong. Gravity's a whole other factor when you're welding overhead.
Okay, yeah, this is way more than just arts and crafts now. And speaking of things I wouldn't want to touch, we have another image here, this welding setup. It's a lot to take in. Hoses, gauges, cylinders. Where does a beginner even start?
That is the question to ask even before you think about striking an arc. This picture, it highlights why safety is paramount from the get-go. Let's start with those cylinders. Those labels aren't just for show, they tell you what's inside, often oxygen and a fuel gas, like acetylene.
Okay, I see that. And those pressure regulators, those look a lot more serious than what I've got hooked up to my barbecue.
And for good reason. Those regulators are crucial. They control the flow of gas from the cylinders, keeping the pressure safe and consistent for welding. Now, notice anything interesting about the hose on that acetylene cylinder?
It's red. Is there a reason it's not just a regular black hose?
You got it. Color coding is key in the welding world. Red hoses, they're specifically for acetylene, which is highly flammable. Double-checking those connections, it's not just about staying organized, it's about preventing potentially disastrous mix-ups.
Okay, I'm starting to get why this is serious business. It's not just about the tools themselves, is it? We've got images here of sparks, fire, even a worker who looks like he had a run-in with a live wire.
You're right, those images are there to drive home the point. These are real dangers that come with the territory. And in welding, what you don't know can absolutely hurt you.
All right, let's unpack those dangers. No sugarcoating. I want to know what we're dealing with.
Let's start with those mesmerizing sparks. They might look like mini fireworks, but don't be fooled.
Yeah, something tells me they're not as harmless as, say, a sparkler on the 4th of July.
Exactly. Those sparks are actually tiny bits of molten metal flying through the air.
Molten metal. Okay, so definitely not something you want landing on your skin.
Definitely not. And here's the kicker. They can travel up to 10 feet from the welding arc. That's farther than a car.
10 feet? Wow, okay, that's a lot farther than I would thought.
That's why we have that image of the worker using pliers to hold the workpiece direct contact is a big no-no.
So those pliers are basically like 10-foot safety chopsticks.
Pretty much. And remember, those sparks, they can ignite flammable materials even from a distance. That's why we have that picture with the big warning sign. Flammable, keep fire away.
Yeah, that one seems pretty self-explanatory. I mean, I wouldn't think you'd need a sign to tell you that, but...
You'd be surprised. Welding generates intense heat and flammable materials. They're more common in these environments than you might think.
Give me some examples. What kind of things are we talking about here?
Solvents, cleaning agents, even certain types of clothing can ignite easily if they get too close to the action.
So like a stray spark lands on a rag soaked in something flammable and boom.
Exactly. That's why it's not enough to just keep things out of sight, out of mind.
So what's the rule of thumb? How far away do you need to keep things?
We're talking at least 20 feet away from any welding or cutting operations.
20 feet? That seems like a pretty big radius. More than just spritzing some water around, huh?
Oh yeah, much more than that. And even then, if things absolutely have to be closer, you need fire-resistant blankets or shields.
Okay, starting to see a theme here. Welding safety is not for the casual DIYer.
Not at all. And
No.
there's another practice that's crucial, even if it seems a little over the top.
Lay it on me. What's the super serious practice?
The fire watch.
Fire watch. Like,
Ooh.
there's someone specifically assigned to just watch for fires.
Exactly. Someone has to observe the welding area for at least 30 minutes after the welding is done.
Wait, I thought once the sparks were gone, you were in the clear.
Not necessarily. Remember, sparks can travel, and fires, they can smolder unnoticed before they erupt into a real problem.
So the fire watch is like the last line of defense, making sure nothing's smoldering in some hidden corner.
Exactly. It highlights how welding safety is not just about common sense, it's about following very specific procedures, even when you think you're done.
Got it. Vigilance is key. Okay, so we've covered the fire hazards. What about electrocution? I mean, that's everyone's worst fear when dealing with anything electrical, right?
And for good reason.
Yeah.
Electrocution is a very real risk with welding, but luckily there are precautions in place.
Like what? What kind of things can welders do to protect themselves?
Well, if you look back at that image of the welding setup, you'll notice the grounding cables.
Oh, right. Those thick cables running from the equipment to the ground, those are there to, like, ground the electricity if something goes wrong.
Precisely. They create a safe path for the electricity to flow into the ground in case of a short circuit.
So instead of zapping the welder, the electricity goes into the ground. That makes sense.
Exactly. It's about diverting that electrical energy away from the person.
Okay, so that's one important safety measure. Anything else people should be aware of in terms of electrical safety, or is that the main thing?
We could do a whole other deep dive on just that, but the key is this. Always, always double check your electrical connections, inspect everything for damage, and never, and I mean never, work on anything that's still energized.
Turn it off, then tinker. Got it. Okay, so we've covered fire, sparks, and electrocution. But what about burns? With all that heat, it seems like they'd be almost impossible to avoid.
You're right, burns are a definite risk, which is why welders suit up the way they do.
You mean all that heavy-duty gear, the gloves, the jackets, the helmets that look like they're straight out of a sci-fi movie?
Exactly. And it's not about looking cool, although I'll admit those helmets have a certain flair.
Oh yeah, they do.
But that gear, it's designed to protect against burns from heat, sparks, and even UV radiation. And those helmets, they're not just for avoiding looking at the arc, they protect the eyes from some serious damage.
So it's basically a welder's suit of armor. Head-to-toe protection from the hazards.
You got it.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about those fumes? I can't imagine breathing in all that smoke can be good for your lungs.
You are right about that. Those fumes are no joke, and they're easy to overlook because they're not as, in your face as some of the other dangers.
Yeah, out of sight, out of mind, and right into your lungs.
Exactly. And those fumes, they're not just smoke. We're talking about a mix of gases and tiny metal particles that can really mess you up.
Tiny metal particles just floating around in the air and then you breathe them in. That can't be good.
Not good at all. And that's where proper ventilation comes in.
So not holding your breath and hoping for the best?
Definitely not. This might mean local exhaust systems to catch those fumes right at the source, or making sure there's good general ventilation in the whole work area. And in some cases, welders might even wear respirators for extra protection, especially in tight spaces.
So ventilation is just as crucial as any other safety gear.
Absolutely critical.
Which leads us to those other invisible dangers, the rays. We've got images here showing all these different kinds of rays shooting off from the arc, UV rays, infrared rays.
Right, and those can cause some serious damage to your eyes, even if you're not staring directly at the arc.
Wait, really? So even if you think you're being sneaky, just glancing at it, you can still get hurt?
You got it. It doesn't take much exposure at all to cause damage, which is why eye protection is non-negotiable for anyone near a welding operation, even if they're not the one doing the welding.
Wow, it's like those rays have x-ray vision or something. They can see you even when you think you're not looking.
That's one way to put it. But in all seriousness, those rays, particularly the UV radiation, can cause something called arc eye, or welder's flash.
Arc eye? Sounds painful.
It is. Basically a sunburn on your eyes. Incredibly painful, and can even damage your vision.
Ouch. Okay, that's one more reason to take those helmets seriously. They're not just for show.
Not at all. Eye protection is just as important as protecting your skin and lungs.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground here, and I have to say, I'm starting to realize that welding safety is about so much more than just common sense. It's about understanding the science behind these hazards and following specific protocols.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
But speaking of specifics, let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of those concrete safety rules. I have to admit, even I'm tempted to think, well, duh, fire is hot. But it seems like welding safety has its own, like, a surprisingly detailed set of guidelines.
You're right. It's not just about common sense. It's about understanding the why behind the what.
Yeah.
And one element that requires a particularly meticulous approach is acetylene.
Acetylene, that was the one in the red hose, right? What makes it so special? Why does it get its own set of rules?
Well, acetylene is highly flammable, even more so than other fuel gases. But what makes it particularly tricky is that it becomes unstable at high pressures.
Unstable? Like, it could spontaneously combust just from being squeezed too tightly?
Not exactly spontaneously, but it can decompose explosively if it's not handled and stored correctly. That's why those pressure regulators we talked about earlier are so critical. They play a vital role in keeping things safe when it comes to acetylene.
Okay, unstable and explosive are not words I want to hear when we're talking about flammable gases. It sounds like there's zero room for error here.
That's right. We're not eyeballing anything when it comes to acetylene. For instance, did you know the maximum safe working pressure is only 15 psi?
15 psi. Wow, that's way lower than I would have guessed. What happens if you go over asking for a friend who likes to live dangerously? Just kidding.
Let's just say it's best to stay well within those limits. And here's another critical number. Acetylene cylinders. You should never use them above 40% of their capacity.
40%. Okay, got it. Why that specific number? Is it like a tipping point where things get dicey?
It all has to do with how the acetylene is stored. See, it's dissolved in a liquid solvent inside the cylinder.
So it's not just pure gas in there.
Nope. And if that pressure gets too high, some of that liquid could be released along with the gas. Bad news.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that would be not ideal. So it's not just the acetylene itself, it's what it's mixed with, a whole other layer of like chemistry happening in that cylinder.
Exactly. And that highlights something crucial about welding safety in general. It's not enough to just memorize a list of rules. You have to understand the why behind them.
Which is where training comes in. Because even with all the safety gear in the world, if people aren't paying attention, not really getting the why, things can go wrong.
Absolutely. The human element, it's huge in this field. And good training, it's not just about teaching someone how to strike an arc or hold a torch. It's about instilling that deep respect for the potential hazards, building a culture where safety comes first every single time.
Which brings us back to those sources from norbook.com. It's fascinating to me that these materials, originally written in Arabic, they emphasize the same safety concerns we'd find in any welding shop, anywhere in the world.
It goes to show, welding hazards, they're the same whether you're in North America, Europe, Asia. And the principles of safety, those are universal too.
It's a powerful reminder that safety transcends borders and languages. Well, we've covered the rules, the gear, the very real dangers, but that human element, that's something to think about. How do we create a culture where everyone feels empowered to prioritize safety, to speak up about potential hazards? That's something worth pondering. A huge thanks to our expert for, well, shedding some light on this surprisingly complex world. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.
Thanks for sticking with us until the end of this episode. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen and engage with our content. If you found value in what you heard today, please don't forget to hit that like button. It helps us reach more people and lets us know we're on the right track. And if you haven't already, make sure to follow our channel so you never miss an upcoming episode. We've got some great topics lined up that you won't want to miss. Lastly, if you know someone who could benefit from this information, why not share the video with them? Spread the knowledge and help your colleagues stay informed. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.